So I'm honored to be here and join and participate in this conference, the Emerging Scholars Conference. It is an important occasion for me. It's my first visit to Chapman and is a community in which I am very interested in continuing to get involved and discuss the next generation of issues for a number of reasons. For one, this represents the community that will take on and continue the work that has been done for the last 20, 30 years around very complex, timely issues that somehow we continue to struggle with. So it is not only important that we are now sitting with the perspective of what's going to happen, what are some of the emerging issues that come, but this is the next generation of faculty and scholars and people working in schools and other agencies to address educational matters that relate to disability and equity. And it is equally important that not only this community will address this issue, but also will be grappling with what's coming to us, wrapped in a number of different ways that sometimes is not necessarily clearly connected to disability, at least for policymakers. And for that reason, then, it is an important opportunity to engage. And the exciting thing is that a community like this has a number of important opportunities afforded to them, not only because of the chance to engage in a preparation at the doctoral level with a disability studies perspective, which affords very sophisticated theoretical grounding to understand issues of disability, but also locating that discussion in larger historical and social contexts. So that's going on for this generation, and I think it's important for us to honor that. But also it's exciting because this community, obtaining the toolkits that are needed to engage, are challenged to address complex issues that have not been present in the scholarly community in the history of disability and special education issues. As we see the convergence of globalization, post-capitalism, post-racialism, and many other forms of difference that are evolving. And so we have this incredible opportunity, but at the same time, we have this amazing challenge to address some of these issues. It is critical for us to keep this in mind. And what I would like to share with you today is work in progress about the very nature of these complex matters. It's something that I've been concerned with for the last 25, 30 years. Before I even moved to the United States, as I was working in Central America with issues of indigenous languages and ethnic communities around disability. It's a matter that keeps me awake sometimes, and I don't have the answers. I'm grappling and striving to engage these issues with an interdisciplinary lens. And it is for that reason that I thought it would be very pertinent for us to think about the complications that the racialization of disabilities bring to our midst, and see if we can begin to frame them in ways that we can address and find solutions that are meaningful to the people affected by this. And hence, the title of the talk is Intersectionalitys Complexity. I believe that intersectionality provides one interesting possibility for us to engage with these issues, and it involves some reflections on past and future research that has been done to understand why all of these students that are considered different by virtue of their race are placed in special education. And because it's work in progress, I really look forward to the conversation afterwards to engage with you and get your feedback and your suggestions, and as well as a discussion. So I focus this lecture on the disproportionate number of racial minority students placed in high incidence disabilities. Research on the racialization of disability affords us opportunities to refine our understanding of how shifting views of difference can reify enduring educational inequities in the contemporary policy and practice landscape of US education. In other words, a key premise of my analysis is that critiques and theoretical refinements on this topic can shed light on enduring justice concerns for disabled and racialized people. The racialization of disability has been debated for decades in the US, but it's been only in the last decade that this problem has received more attention. For instance, federal government actions have increased recently as reflected in the number of published studies acknowledging federal funding, the creation of technical assistance centers expected to address the problem, and key changes in IDEA, such as requirements for reporting, monitoring, and addressing racial inequities in placement patterns. The target of my analysis is the research that examines this problem, specifically how ideas about student social identities or subject locations are framed and scrutinized. Researchers using a medical model of disability have done the bulk of this research, though investigators that rely on a cultural view of human development, as well as disability studies scholars, have made important contributions. Needless to say, the theoretical framings and explanations of these groups of academics vary in important ways. As a case in point, a recent critique of the views of culture that permeate racial disproportionality explanations showed problematic understandings of this construct with concomitant negative repercussions for how racial minority students and communities are envisioned and how the problem ought to be addressed. Substantial differences in views of culture were found in studies grounded in sociocultural perspectives vis-a-vis research framed from a medical standpoint. The former scholarship tended to be informed by a dynamic and historically based notion of culture, whereas the latter work construed culture largely as a demographic marker. In his discussion of the disproportionality research, Ong Dean concluded recently that the nearly exclusive focus on the overrepresentation of racial minorities in special education seems to reflect a self-perpetuating cycle of research findings, data gathering, and further research on the same issues. Is it accurate to conclude that these study findings are redundant? Are the apparent redundancies of research findings solely located in the research done with a medical model of disability? Conversely, if the redundancies are observed across all disability models, why are the paradigmatic differences between the medical, social, and cultural views of disabilities not reflected in these findings? Because the departure point for disproportionality research has been student identity, and in some cases, cultural constructions of difference, most prominently around race, I examine the ways in which the notion of the other student is framed and studied in this knowledge base. I pay particular attention to the ways in which this research has addressed the complexities of the so-called racial minority students' lives and educational experiences. I use the lens of intersectionality to analyze this work. This is a potentially useful construct because it emerged in critical legal studies and has been subsequently developed in the social sciences and humanities precisely as a resource to understand the complexity of marginalized people's experiences in stratified institutions and societies. I realize this is a tricky analytical move, for intersectionality has tended to neglect considerations about disability, and instead has privileged other forms of difference such as race, gender, and social class. Artiles and Minier recently explained that disability is generally included in intersectional analysis merely as a descriptor. They argue such treatment of disability is akin to what Angela Harris called nuance theory in critical race feminism. This theory, quote, constitutes black women's oppression as only an intensified example of white women's oppression, and thus it represents the ultimate example of how bad things are for all women. It is indeed ironic that disability has been largely erased in an analytical tradition whose raison d'etre is to examine the complexities of lived experiences. As Artiles and Minier reminded us, disability, like race, offers not just a nuance to any analysis of difference. Hence, the use of intersectionality in analysis of racial inequities in special education research serves two critical goals. First, it foregrounds the need to pay systematic attention to the complexity of students' experiences in this research. And second, it advances the critical project of intersectionality through the engagement with disability in analysis involving multiple axes of oppression. A challenge in conducting this analysis is the inclusion of the medical, social, and cultural models of disability because of their substantial underlying differences. I argue that we can benefit from a contrapuntal review of this work to identify points of contacts across these bodies of work not readily apparent. I draw on Said's notion of contrapuntalism, in which he linked ideas and practices that are regarded as being opposites or in contradiction. A contrapuntal reading is to emphasize and highlight the disjunctions, not to overlook or play them down. Thus, the analyst assumes responsibility for contrapuntal mediation in the examination of a problem, practice, or issue. For my purpose, it is therefore necessary to examine the ways in which intersectionality has been taken up in this proportionality research that espouses the medical, social, and cultural models of disability. From a contrapuntal standpoint, we're compelled to cross the liminal spaces between these disability lenses. As Said explained in the context of discussing exile, because the exile sees things both in terms of what has been left behind and what is actual here and now, there is a double perspective that never sees things in isolation. Consequently, as Said admonishes us, a crucial implication of a contrapuntal analysis is an unceasing concern with what to read. That is, disproportionality research grounded in contradictory models of disability, attached to an unremitting mindfulness about how to read. That is, being reminded of the intertwined and overlapping histories of race and disability as they intersect with gender, social class, language, sexual orientation, and other forms of difference. How to read these histories and the convoluted ways in which they have intersected means that we ought to be able to think through and interpret together experiences that are discrepant, each with its particular agenda and pace of development, its own internal formations, its internal coherence, and system of external relationships, all of them coexisting and interacting with others. What can we gain from using such a double vision in a contrapuntal analysis of intersectionality in this proportionality research across medical, social, and social paradigms of disability? This is a modest first step in addressing this challenge. Before I describe this analysis, I present background information on the disproportionality problem and research and outline basic ideas related to intersectionality. Why are there so many minority students in special ed? Beth Harry and Jeanette Klingner posed this question in their book-length study of racial inequities in urban contexts in the southeastern United States. It is a 43-year-old question that defies straight answers. The research paints a complex picture in which individual factors, institutional practices, organizational factors, as well as fiscal and bureaucratic pressures contribute to the racialization of disability. The available research has tended to examine the role of individual or structural factors, mostly from a quantitative perspective. A common reading of findings from this literature is that a disproportionate number of racial minorities live in poverty, which in turn can mediate the onset of certain disabilities. At the same time, there is empirical evidence of systemic forces at play. For instance, student race makes a significant contribution to disability identification risk after statistically controlling for poverty level. It's also been reported that racial minority students tend to be placed in more segregated programs than their white counterparts with the same disability diagnosis. African American and Native American students are most affected by this problem at the national level, though complicated disproportionality placement pattern configurations for other racial and linguistic groups become visible as the analytic scale moves from the national to the regional, the state, and district levels. Different configurations of the problem also become apparent when the evidence is examined across geographical regions with disparate histories of economic development, opportunity and wealth distribution, racial relations, and so forth. It is puzzling that over 4 decades of debates on this problem, some commentators still raise the question as to whether racial disproportionality in special ed is a problem. The answer is twofold. First, disproportionality raises the question of misidentification in the case of overrepresentation and exclusion from services in the case of under-identification. Second, overrepresentation, which is the most pervasive pattern documented to date, adds another layer of marginalization and disadvantage for racial minority students, since disability identification is closely associated with a number of long-term negative consequences that include lower academic achievement, higher risk of placement in the juvenile justice system, higher school dropout rate, lower access to higher education, and higher probability to end up in low-paying jobs. Changes to federal law in 2004 require states to track and address racial disproportionality. This legal change was welcomed by most commentators as a step forward in the history of this problem. Nevertheless, as I described recently, confusion about the new legal requirements and manipulations of racial disproportionality definitions, along with converging pressure stemming from educational accountability reforms, are shaping a perverse policy climate and landscape. For instance, disproportionality may be deepening in some states and districts, but is not acted upon by virtue of the data thresholds set up to trigger responses. In addition, federal law now requires that states determine the presence of disproportionality and then decide if such patterns are the result of inappropriate practices. This decision determines if actions and extra resources are needed to address the problem. Unfortunately, the evidence suggests that a sizable number of states are concluding that high disproportionality levels are not the result of inappropriate identification practices. How are researchers, policymakers, and practitioners to monitor and address this long-standing problem, given the complexities sketched out in this section? That's the challenge before us. Let us now turn to present an outline of the notion of intersectionality, which purportedly enables analysts to grapple with complexity in productive ways in the policy, research, and practice realms. Kim Crenshaw advanced the notion of intersectionality through the publication of seminal legal analysis in the late 1980s and early 1990s. Her seminal work grappled with the intersection of race, gender, and social class as it pertains to violence against African American women. The original idea of intersectionality aimed to honor people's multidimensional experiences, particularly women of color, as a response to, quote, the tendency to treat race and gender as mutually exclusive categories of experience and analysis. Therefore, intersectionality challenges the reductionist logic used in traditional analysis and aspires to engage with the simultaneous influence of race, gender, social class, and other forms of difference, as well as the complexities associated with such experiences. The notion of intersectionality challenges essentialist views of groups, single-axis analysis, and additive models of identity. Collins defined intersectionality as an analysis claiming that systems of race, social class, gender, sexuality, ethnicity, nation, and age form mutually constructing features of social organization which shape Black women's experiences and, in turn, are shaped by Black women. McCall, in turn, stated that intersectionality refers to the relationships among multiple dimensions and modalities of social relations and subject formations. She explained that this perspective transcends an emphasis on separate identity categories and, moreover, rejects the separability of analytical and identity categories. This standpoint has promoted the emergence of interrelated terms to describe individuals' experiences that include double jeopardy, multiple oppressions, multiple jeopardies, and interlocking oppressions. The interest in the complexities of identity has led to a focus on the examination of studies called the experiences of the hyper-oppressed, a term she used with some caveats and defined as, quote, subjects who are oppressed by more than one of many interlocking systems of oppression. This perspective is concerned with the scrutiny of within-group diversity, in part to challenge the logic of, quote, group unity equals group uniformity. It aims to document the convergence of multiple forms of oppression in people's lives as shaped by distinct markers of difference. An implication of this analytic perspective includes policy responses that are sensitive to the convergence of multiple forms of oppression. Crenshaw describes structural and political intersectionality and reflected on their implications for representational intersectionality. Structural intersectionality refers to the ways in which the location of women of color at the intersection of race and gender makes our actual experience of domestic violence and remedial reform qualitatively different from that of white women. Extrapolating to my analysis, it can be stated that the location of boys of color from low-income backgrounds, particularly African American and Native Americans, at the intersection of race, gender, and class, makes the experience of disability identification and efforts to address it qualitatively different from that of white middle-class boys. In turn, political intersectionality highlights the fact that women of color are situated within at least two subordinated groups that frequently pursue conflicting political agendas. The need to split one's political energies between two sometimes opposing groups is a dimension of intersectional disempowerment which men of color and white women seldom confront. Indeed, their specific raced and gendered experiences, although intersectional, often define as well as confine the interests of the entire group. For the purpose of my analysis, low-income boys of color with a heightened probability of identification or with disabilities are situated within multiple subordinated groups that frequently pursue conflicting political agendas. This liminal position creates a sort of intersectional disempowerment that middle-class boys with disabilities, low-income boys of color without disabilities, and white girls and girls of color rarely experience. These parallels, preliminary drawn between Crenshaw's original analysis and the critique of the racialization of disability, hint at the potential of an intersectional analysis of this problem. As we set to use the notion of intersectionality in an analysis of research on the racialization of disability, it is necessary to know its limits and understand the critiques leveled against it. For example, intersectionality encompasses both a theoretical stance and a research approach. It is important to note that this scholarship has stressed theoretical critiques at the expense of empirical analysis. And as I explained above, the analytic spotlight has centered on racial oppression issues with less attention to matters of social class and disability. I cannot engage in a discussion about the problems associated with using a hierarchy of oppression in analysis of intersectionality, mainly due to space and time constraints. But I must acknowledge that there is indeed a debate about this point. Hill Collins, for instance, has taken issue with the myth of equivalent oppressions in the United States, concluding that, quote, oppression talk obscures actual unjust power relations. Within this politics, she continues, some groups benefit more from an assumed equivalency of oppression than others. Finally, McCall and Karastatis warned about not confusing intersectionality's critique of oppression categories with the post-structural and post-modern anti-categorical stance. Both the intersectional and anti-categorical approaches are critical of categories, problematize the construction and maintenance of different boundaries, and acknowledge the persistence and impact of categories. However, the former uses categories strategically to reconceptualize them, while the latter rejects them altogether. Let me now summarize some trends in the use of intersectional analysis to study the racialization of disabilities. The bulk of the evidence on racial inequities is based on quantitative analysis, as I mentioned before, mostly based on a medical paradigm. A few quantitative studies have been informed by sociocultural perspectives, though the conceptual architecture of such research still relied on key premises of the traditional disability standpoint. For example, categorical analysis of disabilities concerned with placement probability. Even fewer are qualitative analysis or studies designed with cultural processes in mind. And I present in this section a broad discussion of the main trends in this research with regards to intersectionality. These trends include the use of a unitary approach and hybrid narratives in the use of intersectional analysis. Let me first say a few things about the unitary analysis. Although it might be regarded as an outdated perspective in other disciplines, many disproportionality studies rest on a unitary logic to intersectionality. The structural location of race and disabilities are taken for granted, and membership in these categories is assumed to be enduring and static. This approach assumes a universalistic perspective in which one variable or marker of difference, such as race or class, is assumed to be more important than the others. Thus, researchers set to identify the one variable that has the greatest explanatory power in predicting special education placement. Typically, secondary data sets at the school district, state, or less frequently national levels are used to gauge the factor that best explains or predicts placement risk. In this logic, one explanation fits all members of the group uniformly, and one explanation is considered the most important over time. In this approach, the thought that class or race might have an impact on gender is more a factor of the willy nature of patriarchy than an open theoretical or empirical question. The prominence of a single variable is sometimes imposed through methodological means, such as the use of covariates. This logic was recently used, for instance, in some of the analysis reported by Hebel and his colleagues, in which they were interested in, quote, how student and school characteristics relate to the student's placement into special education. In this study, disability was considered an individual-based condition that can be diagnosed with objectivity via technical means. To illustrate, these authors explain that disproportionate representation may be especially likely to occur for those types of disabilities that rely more on a teacher's judgment and contextual factors, such as LD or EBD, than those types that rely on relatively more objective criteria, and they say such as MR or visual impairment. Building on the force of a unitary logic, individual judgments such as teacher referral decisions are commonly examined as mediated by a single factor, such as teacher race or school classroom demographics. For example, a unitary approach to teacher decision argues that teacher judgment of acceptable student achievement or behavior are necessarily based on the performance of the teacher's particular reference group, which naturally consists of the other students in the school. Thus, the student's peers within his or her school provide the normative standard for identifying whether the student is disabled and so is eligible for special education. Moreover, not only is disability an objective condition, but it is also the result of linear and unidirectional causal influences, even though the links between these factors are correlational. And this move from membership in a racial or ethnic group to living in poverty and ends up in disability status. Macmillan and Reschli, for instance, concluded that, quote, social class and not ethnicity will explain more variance in the rates of detection for these high incidence disabilities, particularly mild mental retardation. Hebel and his colleagues offer a similar theory by explaining that class and race effects are compounded by, quote, the greater exposure of lower income African American and Hispanic children to those factors that themselves contribute to disability identification. Such factors include biological trauma, such as low birth weight, poor nutrition, and child health, and increased exposure to environmental toxins. They continue that they also include social trauma, such as being raised in poverty or by a single or teenage parent. Additional risk factors include parents who are high school dropouts or second language learners, depressed, disorganized, unemployed, or incarcerated, and who reside in high-risk neighborhoods. These factors may result in the lower cognitive and behavioral performance displayed by low-income minority students when they begin kindergarten, end of quote. Other studies have applied similar intersectional reasoning. To conclude, three themes stand out in the unitary work, namely the essentializing of sociocultural groups, the stripping of historical and structural influences in the study of people's actions and decisions, as well as ignoring the problematic historical intertwining of race and disability. Three, the assumption that disabilities are objective notions largely influenced by biological forces. In this sense, the unitary approach naturalizes the racialization of disabilities and searches for evidence that will legitimize racial disproportionality, thus opening a space to claim what Ross called white innocence. That is, the insistence on the innocence of contemporary whites. Ross explained that white innocence has been consistently used in legal rhetoric about race in the US to, quote, make smooth the cracked surface of the law's response to race, obscuring the conflicts and paradoxes, smoothing over choices for which we will later feel nothing but shame. I should note that there are structural conditions in the special ed field that offer incentive for a unitary approach in disproportionality research. For example, federal law defines LD diagnosis as unrelated to socioeconomic and cultural differences. Thus, the law prevents intersectional analysis of disabilities with other markers of difference. Let us now review briefly other kinds of analysis that constitute what I call hybrid narratives of intersectionality. McCall explained the original approach to intersectionality analysis is concerned with critiquing intracategorical complexity. This perspective interrogates the boundary-making and boundary-defining processes of categorization. It acknowledges the stable and even durable relationships that social categories represent at any given point in time, though it also maintains a critical stance toward categories. It also tends to focus on particular social groups at neglected points of intersection. Work by disability studies scholars have relied on premises from this perspective. For instance, Erevels and Miniar linked critical race feminist theory with disability studies theory in their analysis about the historical nexus between race and disability. They situated the connections between race and disability in historical and post-colonial contexts and argue for an intersectional analysis that transcends the limits of unitary intersectionality. Taking the history of the eugenics movement and its concomitant conflation of race with disability, they argued that, quote, the continued association of race and disability in debilitating ways necessitates that we examine how eugenic practices continue to reconstitute social hierarchies in contemporary contexts via the deployment of a hegemonic ideology of disability that have real material effects on people located at the intersections of difference, end of quote. Similarly, in a recent paper, I situated the racialization of disability in historical context through a discussion of their conflation in the laws about, quote, ugly and impaired bodies, and stressed the complicity of science in documenting an association between racial minority status and deviance, illness, and depressed abilities. Sociocultural and disability studies lenses afford a number of opportunities for a more sophisticated analysis of intersectionality. This is the case due to the theoretical apparatus available in these scholarly communities that engages with complexity in more explicit and systematic ways. In this vein, Connor and Ferry explained that disability study offers new and political understandings of disability, which is seen as interacting with social, cultural, historical, legal, and medical discourses, as well as further complicating factors such as race, ethnicity, age, and class. Thus, disability studies offers powerful tools to examine disability as constituted discursively, culturally, and institutionally across multiple contexts. From this perspective, disability is a Protean notion that requires situated scrutiny with sociocultural and historical imaginations. It is too early to gauge stable patterns in intersectionality analysis of racial disparities in special education conducted from disability studies and sociocultural perspectives. However, I comment briefly on some intriguing points emerging in the few intersection analyses available to date. It seems this intersection analysis starts with a compelling critique of disability as historically and bureaucratically situated, showing how definitions evolve over time and reminding us of the ways in which race, class, gender, and disability have had entangled histories, all of which is used to justify an intersectional analysis. In this sense, this work is rooted in an intracategorical intersectional frame. Nevertheless, a closer look shows that the core of the analysis is positioned from the vantage point of disability. That is, all of the other difference markers are linked to disability, but they remain orbiting around the center of a galaxy, which is disability. This is apparent in the fact that comparable in-depth critiques grounded in a social model of race, social class, and gender tend to be absent. The closest this work gets at a more balanced theorizing of these other markers is when it acknowledged that special education placement was used to maintain the racial segregation of schools in the post-Brown era. Thus, on the one hand, disability is socially constructed and is a tool of exclusion for racial minority students, but on the other hand, it is oppression what is stressed in the discussions of race. In other words, the analysts make visible how disability is constituted and used, that is, through the concerted efforts of cultural, historical, ideological processes, while it is only the impact of race, that is oppression, what is foregrounded in the analysis. The former analysis is mindful of processes and instrumentality. The latter is concerned with the end result. Moreover, the framing of disability as socially constructed seems to leak when it is asserted that, quote, for the purpose of exploring the nexus of race and disability, certain disability categories may be considered more problematic than others. It is at this point when the tropes of disability and race converge, and the analysis focuses on the racialization of disability, that complications crystallize. First, a quasi-unitary analysis emerges since the discussion relies on studies framed from a unitary vantage point. The available placement by student race evidence is reviewed and discussed to support the argument about the racialization of disability, but certain structures and blind spots are left intact. By the way, the scholarship committed to a sociocultural perspective, including my own, has made the same move in some studies. This way, we're reminded of the protean nature of disability as it morphs from a socially constructed entity to a medically based category within the same intersectional analysis. Although disabilities are theorized as socially constructed, some categories are called subjective or soft, and an unsettling structural argument is leveled against special education, since the bureaucratic and middle-class nature of this system oppresses families of color. To wit, authors argue, poor or working-class family members are often too overwhelmed to negotiate its intricacies or challenge decisions made by experts. Agency and within-group diversity in low-income racial minority communities are invisible in this statement. It is not surprising, therefore, that this argument ends up subscribing to an essentialist view of culture as reflected in this statement. Quote, African American students are labeled ED with over twice the frequency of white students. However, while discussions about cultural differences in behavior and social interactions have featured prominently in multicultural literature, they have been significantly downplayed in traditional journals of special education. Failure to explore different behaviors, vocabulary, perceptions, and expectations customarily posit students labeled ED as lacking in relation to unquestioned cultural and behavioral norms of the mainstream society, end of quote. In all fairness, disability studies and sociocultural scholars are aware and do recognize more complex views of culture and give analytical space to agency when working with marginalized communities. My point is that a contrapuntal analytic stance shows that competing views of race, disability, and intersectionality coexist in this work, in part because we use some of the analytical tools of the medical paradigm, such as analysis of placement patterns by race, that we strive to contest in the first place. Conversely, it is interesting to note that researchers using a medical perspective have occasionally co-opted tools from disability studies and sociocultural perspectives to undermine the critique about the racialization of disability. Thus, a contrapuntal reading of this work makes visible the coexistence of opposing paradigms within scholarly communities across the board. For instance, Macmillan and Reschly invoked a social construction of disability and ethnicity argument to question the debate about disproportionality. They made this argument from the vantage point of strengthening measurement precision. The message is that because ethnicity and disability are ambiguous constructs that are measured in disparate ways, a degree of caution is needed in interpreting the meaning and significance of the disproportionality findings. They explain that race and ethnicity, quote, should not be interpreted as scientific and anthropological in nature, yet that is exactly how they are treated in the OCR overrepresentation data set, end of quote. They also alluded to the idiosyncratic ways in which such data are collected in schools and highlighted the inaccuracies and inadequacies of racial categories for capturing information about within-group diversity and liminal groups such as mixed-race students. Their advice was, quote, it might be helpful to specify what aspects of ethnicity is believed implicated in special education placements, and overrepresentation data do treat ethnicity as an independent variable and essentially consist of comparisons across ethnic groups. These arguments are used to justify the need to control for ethnicity, particularly as it is often a proxy for social class, which, as I cited above, is their preferred explanation for the disproportionality debate. It is interesting that these authors invoked within-group diversity in racial and ethnic minority groups to advise caution in the analysis of this data, since, after all, these constructs are highly unstable. The implication is that we do not know who these learners really are. But then within the same analysis, these authors summoned an essentialist model of white students and a medical frame of disability to support the poverty hypothesis. They cited a study in which the prevalence of mild mental retardation varied as a function of social class. That is, the lower the status, the higher the prevalence of disability, with no occurrences of this form of mental retardation in the highest social class. The punchline of the argument is the announcement that, quote, the study was conducted in Aberdeen, Scotland, involving only white subjects, thereby avoiding the confound of ethnicity and social class, end of quote. In this scenario, ethnicity and disability are no longer problematic or fraught with measurement challenges, as they were arguing before. And although the study looked at levels of social class, it is claimed that social class is not a confound. Equally important, the authors assume there is no within-group diversity in white communities, a long-standing trope in the othering of non-white communities that keeps white folks at the center of defining consequential categories like ability and disability. Finally, the assertion about the essential nature of white communities flies in the face of the cultural history of Europe and the UK in particular. A contrapuntal reading of the disproportionality literature enables us to discern these hybrid patterns in intersectional analysis and warns us about the need for strengthening theoretical clarity and its concomitant methodological implications. Let me just move to the final section then. The preceding discussion suggests there are substantial challenges and opportunities involved in applying intersectionality as a means to grapple with complexity, particularly around matters of educational equity. The nature of intersectional analysis has great potential for the study of disproportionality research. Nevertheless, my preliminary examination of the ways in which this framework is being applied into this literature suggests we must continue to bring a critical and reflexive perspective to this project, including the review of our own work. For the sake of time, I list next 5 conclusions based on my initial critique that can guide further developments in this line of work. First, build capacity and increase attention. It's clear, based on this discussion, that we need more scholars engaged in the use of intersectional analysis to study disproportionality. Most doctoral programs in special education, and probably few in disability studies in the US, include courses on systematic preparation on the use of intersectionality. Capacity building and attention to this lens will stimulate the growth of communities of scholars that can benefit from each other's engagement with this tool. Second, address the limits of intersectionality, that is to probe the depth within categories. Some scholars are calling for what is described as intergroup analysis. McCall, for instance, critiqued traditional intersectionality analysis because it articulates a single dimension of a category, race, class, gender, at the expense of dimensions within categories. She has produced quantitative intersectional analysis in which different contexts reveal different configurations of inequality in a particular social formation. Artiles and Minier are beginning to use this perspective. Their work examines the lived experiences of individuals as located in structural conditions within which social categories are constructed by and intermeshed with each other in specific historical contexts. Third, adding detail and texture to analysis of categories. An implication of the previous point is the need to look at neglected categories or subdimensions of categories. For instance, a great deal of attention has been given to boys in special education, particularly from racial minority backgrounds, since they are the majority in a number of disability categories. However, important scholarship from feminist theory, sociology, philosophy, and other social sciences on gender and sexuality have not been used to study the experiences of these boys. Moreover, scholars can rush to draw conclusions about gender differences without looking more critically at some emerging evidence. Boys and school disengagement, violence, and crime are examples of this. However, the dropout rates and gang involvement patterns among girls are showing unsettling trends in recent years. Hancock stated, for instance, that the largest gains in arrests and convictions is occurring among young women of color, while teen pregnancy rates are down among all female populations in the US. Fourth, coalition building for advancing equity agendas. Crenshaw explained that intersectional work can create contexts and conditions for various identity groups to form coalitions not previously considered. This project can advance important equity agendas in more politically powerful ways. Coalitions between inclusion advocates and individuals addressing racial disproportionality, for instance, could have been formed in the early years of the inclusive education movement. And fifth, disciplinary reflexivity through contrapuntal critiques. The use of contrapuntal critiques in the examination of intersectionality can offer opportunities for dialogue across communities of scholars within and between disciplines. To illustrate, the analysis reported today could be used to open dialogues among researchers using social, medical, and sociocultural models of disabilities as a means to promote theoretical refinement and advance ambitious programs of equity research. And I hope that by now we have a general sense of the incredible complexities and challenges ahead of us as we try to apply intersectional analysis to this issue of racial disproportionality in special education. I welcome your comments and responses, and I look forward to a good exchange. I believe we have a few minutes, so thank you again for your attention this morning.